A new ad campaign from a men's shaving company is causing quite the controversy. Here is a look.
It's been going on far too long. We can't laugh it off.
Who's the daddy? What I actually think she's trying to say.
Making the same old excuses.
Boys will be boys.
Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys.
But something finally changed.
Allegations regarding sexual assault and sexual harassment.
But she says
And there will be no going back. Because we believe in the best in men.
Gillette's The Best Men Can Be campaign has ignited praise because of the ad's call for men to hold other men accountable for their actions. But on the flip side, critics say the ad draws on harmful cliches and stereotypes. It may be just an ad, but what does it say about masculinity? And what's the path moving forward for men in the wake of the Me Too movement? Joining us to discuss all that and more are Tim Goldich, president of the National Coalition for Men's Chicago chapter and author of the book Loving Men, Respecting Women, The Future of Gender Politics, and Paloma Delgadillo. She is president of the Chicago chapter of the National Organization for Women, and welcome both to Chicago tonight. Tim Goldich, first of all, the National Coalition for Men, I have to confess I haven't heard of it. What is that group?
Well, that's a group of, it's a volunteer organization. It's as its name suggests, it advocates for male perspectives. Its goal is to balance out the gender belief system, to raise awareness of what I'll call the other half of gender reality, in many ways in which men are doing very poorly in our world today. If you tear your eyes from the very tip of the success pyramid and look anywhere else, men are not doing very well. And we would like to raise awareness of this so that there can be a balance in our perspectives on men and women.
So, from that perspective, what do you see in this ad?
Well, what I see, I see a collection of lecherous jerks that inspire only disgust. I see a sort of infinite progression of men all behind their stereotype outdoor grills, and they all have the same sort of dumb, self-satisfied arrogance in their look in their faces and in their postures. And
so you're saying you see cliches and stereotypes in that?
Yes, and I see that as that was directed by this Kim Garrig, who created that film.
Paloma Delgadillo, what do you see when you see the ad?
So I would actually disagree with that. I see in many ways the men who I grew up around, neighbors, people who exhibit harmful behaviors, not in their action, but in their inaction. You see men fail to step up. You see men perpetuating the status quo, and instead of rising to the occasion, kind of engaging in the behaviors they've always engaged in. And I think it's not, the emphasis again is not really in demonizing men and talking about how they're terrible people, but that the way things are going now cannot continue.
Tim, the ad has had more than 27 million views on YouTube. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that this topic is incendiary in our culture. This is an enormous emotional upswell. So it's triggered a big nerve for both men and women. What men are looking at, I think, is shaming. I think what they're seeing in it is a pattern of ever-escalating shaming of men. I think they're seeing that there is no masculine gold being defined or acknowledged to exist. It's only a toxic masculinity that is acknowledged to exist, and apparently the only redemption is to police this toxic masculine. The only good men we see are the ones that are policing this toxic masculine.
Paloma Delgadillo, is this ad about shaming?
I think the ad is about calling out behaviors that aren't great. And this is something we care about not only when talking to men, but even within the feminist movement and talking about intersectional feminism. I know I've talked to many people, and one of our largest points of discussion is how we as women can be better allies to each other. So for instance, straight, cisgendered women can be better allies to LGBT women, how white women can be better allies to women of color. So I don't see this big threat, this shaming that's happening, when this is something that I know within our movement we encourage. And I find it very interesting that it's interpreted as shaming when we're asking our male allies to do a little bit better.
Tim Goldich, do you personally feel shamed by this ad?
I personally feel offended by it. You know,
do you feel threatened by it?
Well, yes, in the sense that, you know, as you know, I'm sure the prestigious APA, American Psychological Association, has recently declared officially that the traditional masculine is, in their word, harmful.
Since you brought that up, let's take a look at exactly what it is. The APA Monitor reports that the APA has released its first ever guidelines for practice with men and boys, and they draw on more than 40 years of research showing that traditional masculinity is psychologically harmful and that socializing boys to suppress their emotion causes damage. Paloma Delgadillo, your reaction to that step on the part of the APA?
I mean, encouraging children generally, telling them that they can't freely express their emotions, telling young boys that they can't cry, and they have to be strong from a young age, that is unacceptable. In my opinion, I think we need to understand that gender exists on a spectrum. We need to understand that boys are allowed to be emotional creatures. They are allowed to have deep, emotionally intimate relationships with each other. And the way that we've raised men and boys with this idea that they can't do that is completely unacceptable.
Tim Goldich, how do you respond to that traditional notions of masculinity, in quotes, can be very harmful to men themselves in terms of limiting their ability to be full human beings?
Well, of course it can. Of course it can. But, you know, there's a light and a shadow side to everything. You know, to reduce the masculine, the archetype of masculine all through history, and what the masculine has done and meant and achieved, and to reduce it all just to a pathology is outrageous. Masculinity, just like femininity, has to be seen in both in full spectrum of what it is and what it does.
Give me a couple of examples, or give me one example of a traditional notion of masculinity that you find positive.
Well, okay, so within an emergency situations, you know, men do basically everything it takes to maintain the whole infrastructure of this society. And they do this by being stoic in many cases and foregoing their own personal pain and discomfort and doing things that are often dangerous or filthy, like keeping the sewage going or dangling hundreds of feet in the air in order to tuck point buildings, or doing the ice road trucking, or the logging, or keeping the streets covered with asphalt in 100-degree heat.
Paloma Delgadillo, your reaction? Some valid points?
My reaction is that you shouldn't be ascribed from a young age what traits you choose to take on and what traits you don't. So, I mean, I think of all these traits that were just mentioned by Tim, and I think about my dad. My dad had a great capacity, and still does have a great capacity, to be strong yet warm-hearted, to be stoic when something happened to us, and yet to also nurture and be kind and listen to us cry. So I think, well, that is definitely a positive aspect. I don't think that men have to be just that. They can have vivid lives.
Closing comment, Tim Goldich, on this ad and the issues that it raised.
Okay, so I would say that in the realms of gender issues, gender complaint, gender activism, gender advocacy, gender definition, gender studies, gender politics, gender anything. There is feminism on the one hand, and on the other hand there is nothing. At NCFM we consider this a kind of ideological dictatorship, and we rebel. We think there's a whole other half of gender reality. We need to be looking at female power. We need to be looking at female shadow. We need to be looking at male vulnerability. We need to be looking at at male experiences of powerlessness so we can balance things out.
Tim Goldich, Paloma Delgadillo. I think this calls for a further discussion, continuing discussion. Clearly, we just scratched the surface. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
And up next, tips to follow during what may be your least favorite time of year. No, not the cold. Tax season.
Don't miss one of our stories.